Just a little bit of background on my presentation before I get started here. I first gave this presentation in 2012 at the Go-It Exchange, and Ellen asked me to come back and give an update because it's been 6 years and there's a lot that's happened in the omega-3 pharmaceutical industry. My perspective has changed a little bit in that time because back then, I was more of a casual observer looking at the pharmaceutical industry from the outside. I wasn't somebody who was actually active in the industry. And of course, now I work at KD, and we're one of the largest pharmaceutical API manufacturers in this space. So I have a very different, more real-world perspective, so I hope I can provide a little better insight than my 2012 presentation for those of you who saw it. But I'd like to start by talking about the R&D pipeline in the pharmaceutical industry, because back in 2012, I put up a slide with these statistics that said the active pipeline at that time had 34 omega-3 based pharmaceutical targets in the pipeline in various phases. There were 12 companies exploring this area of those 34 products. And there were, I thought at the time, this incredible diversity. There were 17 different health outcomes, distinct health outcomes that they were looking at trying to commercialize pharmaceuticals for. If you look at the active pipeline today, it's multiplied many-fold. So there are now 88 active pharmaceutical targets in the pipeline, targeting 53 different distinct health conditions. And of course, the number of companies in this area has trebled. But the interesting thing I think about it is this isn't really the whole story. There's also a lot of failures. So these numbers are not reflected in the active pipeline. These are the ones that have left the active pipeline. 66 pharmaceuticals have been abandoned because for a lot of reasons, and I'll get into that in a second. 8 companies who were actually very much proponents of the omega-3 pharmaceutical space are now out of business. They've just completely disappeared, and of course, their entire pipeline goes with them. And of course, there are 25 health outcomes that we thought omega-3 pharmaceuticals had a lot of promise for that aren't even being researched anymore. So if you add those numbers up from the last slide, there's more than 150 pharmaceutical targets that have actually been researched for omega-3s. If you look at, I think there's a lot of lessons in these failures. And so if you look at why these products have failed, I think that the common belief would be that, okay, well, if a product was going through the pharmaceutical research process and it failed, it must be because it didn't show any effect. And certainly that's a large portion of them. You can see that 43% of them never actually made it beyond animal trials. They were products that in cell cultures or in screening showed a lot of promise, and then when you actually got to the point of trying to give it as an intervention to animals or humans, or to animals, they didn't show the same benefit, and so it became risky to try to replicate that in a human trial. But what's more interesting to me is the large part of the rest of the pipeline that failed for what I would consider management or human issues. For one, you had a lot of companies that were taking kind of a shotgun portfolio approach. If you're a startup R&D pharmaceutical company, do you want to put all your eggs in one basket, or do you want to take the funding that you have and distribute it amongst a few different conditions and see if you can find which one has the best odds of success? That's kind of a standard R&D pharma model. But what it means is that you often have products that are rationalized out of the portfolio. So Amarin is a great example because they had schizophrenia and all these other psychological drug targets in their pipeline, but then they saw the signal that the triglycerides had probably the best chance of getting to market, and they basically rationalized those other things out of their portfolio. That happens all the time. It doesn't mean that there's no effect there. It just means that you have scarce resources when you're an R&D pharma company, and you need to focus on where you have the best chance of success. Company funding is another aspect that I think many managers would say is out of their control, but really at the end of the day, what it means is you couldn't tell a compelling story to get the funding you needed in order to actually advance through the pipeline, even though you have strong clinical data. 14% of the products that have failed have been in that bucket. And in some cases, those companies, as I mentioned, go out of business. They go bankrupt and can't continue. There are some, of course, that fail in clinical trials, but it's not nearly as many as I think people think. I think the most recent failures we've seen are Trilogy, one with the Capre drug and Epanova in the strength trials. Neither of those drugs have actually been pulled from the market or out of the pipeline. But I think those are just recent examples of where companies can fail in a clinical trial and then they end up probably not moving through the pipeline. And then there's another bucket, which is small here, but I think it's a very interesting bucket. It's that the market becomes unattractive. There are a number of examples where outside of this space, but I think you're starting to see in this space, where you have a drug and you're going through the R&D pipeline and it's almost a race to see who can get to market fastest. But if you're not the fastest, suddenly the market dynamics change. There's cheaper products that are on the market, they perform better, or something turns generic, and so you're trying to bring an originator drug to market in a market that's really focused on generics at a much lower price, and it becomes unattractive, so they just end up canceling them. But if we look at what the pipeline looks like today, this is the distribution of all of the drug targets that I've been tracking and where they are in the research pipeline. I think there's a few interesting things here. So I'll start at the top, but autoimmune diseases. The reason I think this is interesting is because autoimmune diseases were the first recorded medical use of fish oils back even in the Roman era. And by the way, Barcelona has a special history there. This city was founded by the Romans in order to facilitate the trade of olive oil, fish oil, seafood products to Italy, or to Rome. So this is a very special place from that perspective. But if you look at where those products are in the pipeline, really you see them still at an early phase there. And this is something I've never really quite understood, and I believe the reason you don't see a lot more research in this condition or in these groups of conditions is because the recorded use, it goes back so far that it'd be very difficult to get a patentable drug. And so what you see there is that the chemical forms of the products that are in the pipeline there aren't triglycerides. They aren't ethyl esters generally. They're more novel forms because you can get some patent protection and intellectual property protection by focusing on these additional types of molecules. The other thing I think is interesting is if you look at these conditions, you see very quickly that cardiovascular diseases and dyslipidemia are two conditions that tend to be further down the pipeline. They tend to be further like the phase 2, phase 3 and approved drugs. And I think that's not a surprise because, of course, cardiovascular research in the omega-3 space has been ongoing for a couple of decades now, and so it's natural that those would be further along in the process. But Norman won the GOED Award last night for his role in discovering DHA in the brain, dating back to the 70s, which of course was when the cardiovascular research started. And yet, if you look at the neurological diseases, those are all very early stage in the pipeline. So I don't know what's driving that, but I think there's this vast dichotomy because everybody says omega-3s are good for the heart and good for the brain, but you see the heart drugs are very advanced in the process and the neurological drugs are not. The other thing I think is kind of interesting on this chart is if you look at what tends to move forward in the process, they tend to be ethyl ester products. I imagine that's simply a timing issue. Those were the first ones that were really starting to be researched, but for whatever reason, there are a lot more ethyl ester products at the later end of the pharma pipeline than earlier on. And by contrast, you see a lot of different colors here for representing the other chemical forms earlier in the pipeline. It's also interesting to look at the forms that have been terminated, that have left the pipeline. And here what you see is that free fatty acid products tend to fail more often than any other type of product in the pipeline. And I don't know why that is, but maybe that might have a role when we see the results of the strength trial. That might lead to some understanding of why that trial was discontinued for futility. The other color that you see represented there is orange. Those orange products are the lipid mediators, the resolvins, the protectins, the pre-resolving lipid mediators. That to me also is very interesting because those haven't made it very far. If you look at that section of the failure chart, though, if you were to dissect the failure chart to look at just those lipid mediators, what you'd find is that most of those fail not because of clinical research, it's because they actually don't even make it far enough to get to clinical research. They fail in the preclinical phase, or they fail because the companies go out of business. And I really don't quite understand that because the research there is so intriguing, and it's very interesting to see these powerful results. At the Go Ahead Exchange 4 years ago in Tenerife, we had a really interesting speaker, Tom Van Dyke, who came and talked about the role of those lipid mediators in periodontal disease. And he presented really compelling clinical evidence. But yet that whole area hasn't even advanced since that exchange 4 years ago. So I don't know what's driving that, but I think it's really something to try to understand. This is a chart. I've looked at the drugs that have failed in the different chemical forms. For the scientists in the room, this is not statistically significant. For everybody else in the room, I still think it's interesting. If you look at the stuff that has failed the least, the stuff on the right, your left-hand side of the chart, that stuff tends to be, those are the compounds that tend to have the most oxidative stability. And the stuff on the right-hand side of the chart tends to be the stuff that oxidizes fastest. I don't know if there's any trend there or anything to look at, but I just thought that was interesting. So just something that stuck out to me when I was looking at the data. But I think there's another, we in the omega-3 space tend to be, I think, fairly insular. We look at omega-3s and we get tunnel vision and we don't look beyond this. The omega-3 pharma R&D pipeline has led to a lot of research in many other fatty acids. And at the end of the day, we make lipids. The processes for manufacturing lipids, the underlying use in our body is all kind of tied together the same. But for whatever reason, omega-3s have really received a lot of the focus. But the omega-3 research has actually led to research on other fatty acids in pharmaceuticals that I think is interesting to look at. So just in terms of plain fatty acid forms, where you're looking just at the triglycerides, ethyl esters, free fatty acids, there are omega-6 and branch chain fatty acid products in the pipeline. And then they're taking a lot of the companies that are in this area are taking a common approach with omega-3s where they're trying to structure the fatty acids. They're changing the molecular structure. They're conjugating other molecules with those fatty acids. And you see that with olive oil. You see that with arachidonic acid, with flaxseed oil. They're isolating and concentrating the fatty acids they want from those sources and adding other molecules in order to target specific conditions like neuropathic pain or Friedreich's ataxia or NASH, which is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, so basically fatty liver disease. And then, of course, the lipid mediators I mentioned, where I think there's so much intriguing research that needs to get pushed further down the pipeline. That's happening. They're oxidizing these other fatty acids that are non-omega-3s and creating those same types of lipid mediators from those fatty acids and putting them in the pipeline. I haven't put company names here, but these are the names of the pharmaceuticals that are being researched right now. These are all early stage. None of these are really to the stage of clinical trials yet. But if you're interested, you can, of course, Google these compounds and find out more. If we shift from looking at the pipeline to the commercial market, this is largely GOED data and Frost & Sullivan growth rates applied to that data. And we hired a consultant, Roland Berger, to give us a little bit more insight and critical analysis into where this market would be going. And what we see is, from a volume perspective, the pharma market's been growing very slowly over the last few years, but it's really expected to take off going forward. That's largely, of course, due to the rise of Vascepa. But what's interesting to me is that there's been this massive price compression due to the generic market, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But going forward, we expect to see things recover, and I think the pharma market is going to grow to near the size in a few years of the dietary supplement market. The originators that are actually on the market today, and by originators I mean branded pharmaceuticals, up until now everybody's talked about Lovaza, Epidel, Vascepa. That's kind of what everybody's looked at. But there are more originator drugs than those, and some of them are related. Each of them has something very interesting, though, to tell, very interesting story to tell. I think Lovaza, everybody knows, it was the first blockbuster omega-3 drug exceeding $1 billion in sales. Omicor was the predecessor to Lovaza. It was marketed primarily in Europe under Omicor. But what I think is interesting about that is it was the first drug that was approved for post-heart attack treatment, but it never actually had a placebo-controlled trial to get that indication. But in Italy, it became the standard of care. Anytime you had a heart attack, you got an Omicor pill. And of course, when Lovaza tried to come to market in the US, under the Omicor name at that time, they had to do placebo-controlled trials, and they didn't get a heart attack indication. It was focused on triglyceridemia. Lotriga is a similar product in Japan, and what I think is interesting about Lotriga is it showed for the first time that you could bring a branded product to market in a market where the primary drug, Epidel, had already gone generic, and grow the market. So you're coming in with a product that's higher priced, but what they've done is they've actually brought new consumers into the market, new patients, and the Epidel market has more or less stabilized, but Lotriga continues to grow. So how they've been able to do that, I think, is very interesting. Rosumega is a fascinating product in Korea because it's a polypill. It's the first time an omega-3 has been combined with another pharmaceutical, in this case a statin drug, to provide one product something that reduces cholesterol as well as triglycerides. Epidel, everybody, I think, or at least I hear often that Omicor was the first omega-3 pharmaceutical on the market, but Epidel preceded it by more than a decade. And Epidel is a really interesting product because it's done a few things in its life cycle. One is that you can see the little seamless capsules, the little tiny beads. It was the first omega-3 pharmaceutical to go into that form, where you basically swallow a sachet of little tiny pills. And it's done very well in that format. In addition to that, it was the first product that went OTC, where you didn't need a prescription to get the product. It kind of failed in that form because it was still difficult for a Japanese consumer to get the product. You had to go interview with a pharmacist and fill out a questionnaire. But it was the first omega-3 that actually went OTC. Vascepa, everybody knows, has the largest CVD risk reduction demonstrated in people who are already being treated for cardiovascular disease. And Novotears is an interesting one that I don't hear anybody to really talk about. And in fairness, I have to say that I don't know if they actually use DHA in this product. They describe it as a plant-based long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, which I assume is DHA, but I've also heard a lot of people describe ALA as a long-chain omega-3, so it may not be an actual DHA product. But what's interesting about it is they're pursuing pharmaceutical approval, but they've already been approved as a medical device. And so it's on the market in a number of countries as a medical device, and it's a product for dry eye disease, where they've conjugated one existing dry eye drug to a fatty acid. And of course, I think everybody is focused and fascinated by Amarin right now and what's going on. The CEO of Amarin said at the JP Morgan healthcare conference a couple of weeks ago that they're not there yet, but they're working to be able to grow this product to $5 billion in sales. And right now, they're projecting that this year, in 2020, they're almost going to double the size of the market for this product to $700 million. And of course, that's right now, they're just in the US. They've just been approved in Canada. They have an approval in the Middle East, and they're in the process of being approved in China. So just from geographic expansion alone, they should be able to grow this product significantly, let alone trying to convince the doctors that there's something really special about this product. But because of everybody's focused on what's happening with Vascepa and how fast it's growing, there's a lot of question around which originator drug is going to be the next one to hit the market. And I think there's a few options. I've looked at the pipeline, and I think Epanova is an option. Even though the strength trial failed, they're actually already approved for hypertriglyceridemia reduction, but it never actually got marketed for that condition. So AstraZeneca said in after the trial failed, they said, we're still looking at strategic options, which means they may license it out to somebody. And there's potentially some extra life behind this drug. So if they find a partner for this, that could be the next one. The Capre drug that failed in the Trilogy 1 trial actually still has a second trial that's supposed to come out in the next 2 weeks, Trilogy 2, that could support hypertriglyceridemia reduction. So if that trial shows positive results, that could come to market. We actually have a product called Alpha, which is for a type of colon cancer, familial adenomatous polyposis. And it's in phase 3 clinical trials that'll end this year. And the phase 2 results were really positive. But it's an EPA-free fatty acid and would be one of the first free fatty acids that actually makes it to market if the clinical trials are positive. In China, there's actually a number of drugs that are in the approval process. They've been sitting technically approved, but the Chinese government, before they issued a marketing authorization, wants to see a lot more data in Chinese populations. So all these companies are actually in clinical trials to generate that data, and then they should come to market probably all around the same time. And of course, Catabasis has a product for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That's a product that is in phase 3 trials right now, but a lot of trials in DMD have actually been successful in phase 2 and then failed in phase 3. So we'll see if they're going to be successful. Lastly, I want to look at the generic market for a second. In the generic market is interesting because I think this chart says it all. This is what happens to pharmaceuticals when generics come into the market. The sales of originator product just collapse instantly. The generic market for omega-3s on a global basis, you saw a little bit of a bump in growth from 2014 to 2015 as different markets shifted to generic, but this is, of course, all Omicor Lavazza types of products and Epidel. But you can see it's a pretty stable market. It's a market that once a market turns generic, the volume shifts very quickly to these generic products because they're more economical for insurance companies to cover. And so, it's not, I wouldn't say, a hugely exciting business. But one thing that for omega-3 companies that's interesting is that, the API, the companies who are big in generics, they don't make omega-3s themselves. And so they're using the same supply chain that dietary supplement companies are using, that other omega-3 pharmaceutical companies are using. So, the name of the game in generics is, can you get in early enough to make a lot of money before the prices come way down? The omega-3 derivatives, the lipid mediators, I think are important to keep in mind and watch going forward. For us as an omega-3 industry, they're a little different than just producing a standard ethyl ester product. The ones that are in the pharmaceutical pipeline aren't necessarily made the same way. There's two common approaches you can see. So one is you can actually take an EPA or DHA molecule and specifically try to oxidize them in order to produce these lipid mediators. And there's one pharmaceutical pathway that way. You can also chemically synthesize the molecules, and when you talk to a lot of these pharmaceutical companies as an omega-3 supplier or an omega-3 company, a lot of them will say, I think what you're doing is interesting, and the research that your industry has sponsored and founded, has helped our company, but we don't need you because we're just chemically synthesizing these in a lab, and so we don't need your product. So it'll be interesting to watch what happens with this because it has the potential to take away demand from actual omega-3 based compounds because these are so much more biologically potent. And maybe they use a completely alternative supply chain. And then lastly, I just want to close with one other thought about the pharma market. Obviously, the pharma market is really big. It's growing very fast because of Vascepa right now. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's a very difficult market to compete in. And this is something where my perspective has definitely changed from when I was at GoEd and now in my new role. It's an amazingly fast-growing market, but it's not fast-moving. If you want to do anything, whether you're making a small little change or you're bringing a new supplier in or whatever, it takes months to years in order to make those small changes in the pharma process. And so aside from the fact that it can take a decade or more just to bring a product to market, once you're in market, little changes take a very long time. So it's very difficult to compete in that market if you don't have other business supporting your business model. EPA and DHA, I think, are what everybody focuses on as the valuable target components in these products, but whatever else is in the product is equally important, whether it's an impurity or a conjugated molecule, and that also creates a lot of difficulties because you're not just trying to maximize the amount of omega-3 in the product, you're trying to also meet a spec for everything else in the product. And then lastly, the pharma market really likes purified compounds. And what that means, if you're going to do a pure DHA or a pure EPA product, it requires a lot of technology and a lot of capital in order to get there. So you've really got to know what you're doing. It's not something you can just come in and use a molecular distillation column to make a pure DHA product at a commercial scale. It's really much, much more difficult than that. So that's basically what I've learned from the market and where we are today. I think the pharma market has a lot of future to it. It's got a lot of legs. It's like the omega-3 research. I always said we're only at the beginning there. We're only at the beginning of the pharmaceutical market. Thank you. And